is it even worth talking about stock markets in general? I mean, it's just been a total mess for much of 2011.
Exactly. No, you're right, and it's quite depressing, I think, particularly across Africa. And as we know, globally there's so much uncertainty, and that's what investors don't like. And I know we've been saying it for the whole year, but it's really manifesting itself in Africa, and we've said it again and again. The volumes are down, but you look at some of these markets down 10, 20, 30%, and it's really, really not pretty. So difficult to gauge, and the scary thing is it's difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
I know you're not a betting man, but I want you to make a call. China's economy is slowing down. We've still got these debt issues in Europe. The banks are over-leveraged in France, hence a downgrade. We're seeing employment figures recover in America, but that hasn't led to significant GDP recovery. Are we headed for a recession in 2012?
Yeah, I would say so. If I had to look at everything being equal, like you're saying, it's not pretty across all fronts, and again, it's just the uncertainty, and there is no real catalyst. I think we need some sort of finality, particularly on the Europe crisis, because that's what we find impacts us the most, is stories, positive or negative, about Europe. So I think until we have some finality, and whether it's good or bad, I think we need to have something where people can actually sit back and take stock of where we are.
Well, we'll wait and see those bond sales this week. Tanzania, though, has recorded a bit of a stronger shilling. Now, there have been some IPOs here, but people are really interested in the breweries.
Correct, yeah. Well, and one in particular, Tanzania breweries. Obviously, it was a very popular issue. It's still very difficult to gauge exactly what went on, even though the issue closed about 2 weeks ago now. So it's very difficult to call, but there was a lot of interest, so we think it was oversubscribed.
Okay, in Malawi, the National Bank of Malawi is up 5%.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't much news out about that. I think it was just on some very sort of thin volumes of trading. But bigger news was obviously Press Corp announcing their interim results, the year-end results. They made an announcement that these were going to be lower than expected. And obviously that's a big stock. It's the main stock in Malawi. So that really hasn't really fed through, but we'll see what happens over the next week or so.
Okay, Zambia is an interesting story. They've had elections, there's a new government, and they've got some stocks that really are enticing investors.
Yeah, and it trades in funny ways, because obviously the bigger volumes typically go through in blocks and in the bigger names like Zambeef, etc. So it's a tough one to call, particularly when volumes are quite low. And last week in particular, I mean, Zam Sugar was up almost 14%. The interim results were out and they showed a massive increase in earnings and dividends. But it wasn't all positive. We saw the low sugarcane yields and low sucrose levels. So it's interesting times there in Zambia, like you say.
Just sugar producers in general, we're told that obviously prices are set to rise because demand is on the up, but production is quite narrow and concentrated. So sugar exporting countries should do well. The Mauritian economy, for instance. Yeah,
you would think so, but I think it all comes down to managing your costs, because as you say, production might be down, but your exporting prices will be higher. So I think if you can manage your costs very well, I think that's the best plan of action. Okay, Kenya, slight recovery. What's made that turnaround? Well, it's almost too little too late, you would say. Hey, again, very, very thin volumes, but I think we've just had some investors coming and saying these stocks are just too cheap. We have to start picking some up now. So we saw some selective buying, but investors are playing it very well, I think. It's very difficult to work orders when the volumes are so thin. So people are looking for blocks in names they like, at levels they like. EABL was up 5%, which was the biggest driver in terms of the positive there. Ghana, EcoBank? Yeah, I mean, not much there. It was interesting that EcoBank was slightly down despite there was an approval to merge with Trust Bank of Ghana, which is one of the local banks. So that news came out, but funny enough, the name traded down, which confounded a lot of us. Okay, let's look at the worst performing bourses. Zim Mining down 22%. Yeah, that's horrific, isn't it? You can say it's the ugliest of the ugly there with that. Really, it was due to Rio Zim, as we saw. They tried to have a plan to restructure the debt into debt equity sort of swap. And that was vetoed by the shareholders at an EGM last week, which really hurt the name. And then Hwangi followed it down. That was also down 20-odd%. So not pretty in Zim Mining at all. Are you expecting this particular index to recover in the year ahead? Because there are only about 4 major stocks on the Zim Mining index. Correct. If they move, it has a really significant impact. But there's this indigenization, there are these shareholder squabbles. Correct. Yeah, there's so much uncertainty. But I mean, if you look what they've done for the past few months, particularly since the indigenization rules and laws came out a few months ago, it's really been hurt. But Hwangi particularly, there was no real news. It just kind of followed Rio Zim down. So it's interesting. But again, 4 stocks on the index, it can do anything really. The Zim Industrial Index is also down, and it also has blue chips that drive it, the Econets, the Deltas, and Score. Correct. Yeah, again, I mean, there's a lot more listed stocks, obviously, than the mining, but really 4 or 5 stocks really drive everything that happens in that market. Risk appetite for Zim, as we know, due to the political issues you mentioned, has been a bit soft for the last sort of year, really. And that's what happened. You know, Econet was down 5% actually, and that was the biggest drag down in Zim.
Why would Econet be down? They're doing so much in terms of expanding their subscription base, they're introducing new technology, mobile facilities. There are all these innovations that made it look like it's got a really significant plan and program for the year ahead.
Correct. No, you're right. I mean, I think a lot of people are positive, but it's been a sort of up and down, a bit of a yo-yo over the last few months. Again, I don't think it's a stock-specific issue. I think it's more country issue. Political side, you know, there are people still liking it.
Because it's a liquid stock.
Correct. It's the most liquid stock on the index.
So it reflects. Okay. Yeah. Egypt.
Yeah, Egypt was interesting because we actually saw some large volumes going through, which has not been the case for most of the year. But there was a lot of rebalancing from international funds. So obviously that typically goes through in a lot of crosses, you know, which is not normal volume, if you understand the difference. But what we're seeing is a focus switching from the political environment, which is what it has been for the whole year, switching more to a macro situation. And people are also trying to look at where do we recover and how do we recover from here.
I always say to you, you know, the reason why you bring Egypt to us is because fortunately or unfortunately, that's the market with the closest proximity to Europe. It has high volumes coming in from Africa funds. It's the gateway in many ways to Africa. So if we're seeing flip-flops in Egypt, what does that mean for the rest of sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, it just shows you what the sentiment is. And unfortunately, with the rest of Africa, where you've got much higher trading costs associated with those trades, you find that people tend to participate less. So they trade in South Africa and Egypt, where your costs are a lot lower. But yes, when you've seen the wide oscillations, obviously it impacts differently across Africa.
Oscillations, that's more sophisticated than flip-flops. Nigeria. All right, let's talk about what's going on there. I mean, there are much better yields and more attractive yields on the fixed income side of the market. But even with a currency that's, okay, it's a bit under pressure, but with all sorts of measures to keep the currency strong, to make fixed income securities attractive, nobody is going into the equity side of the market.
No, and you can't blame them. As you're saying, with the attractive yields and the fixed income side, it's almost a no-brainer to participate in that rather. So we're seeing very quiet in Nigeria, and obviously foreigners aren't participating, but what's quite scary is the locals also aren't. You know, they're going towards the fixed income. So it's an interesting time in Lagos.